Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Secrets, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we're traveling to a time when staying warm was less about comfort and more about basic human survival. A time when blanket meant whatever you could find that wasn't currently on fire, and heating system meant you hoped the cow was feeling generous tonight. So before we dive into this frost-bitten nightmare, grab your warmest blanket, maybe make yourself some tea, or, if you're historically accurate, pour yourself a pint of slightly sour ale and pretend it's breakfast. And while you're at it, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Not because it'll keep you warm, but because it'll warm my heart, which is scientifically proven to raise the room temperature by approximately half a degree. All right, let's set the scene. It's the year 1349 or 1220. Or honestly, pick any year between 500 and 1500 AD, because if it's winter, it's miserable. The medieval world didn't have thermostats, fleece pajamas, or heated car seats. What it did have were drafty huts, damp straw beds, and a level of cold that could make your bones creak in Latin. Outside, the fields lie silent under snow. The sky hangs gray, heavy, and unmoving, like the lid on a cosmic soup pot. You can almost hear the silence, broken only by the occasional moo of a confused cow or the sound of someone coughing through 15 layers of wool. Inside the village, smoke curls lazily from the holes in roofs, because chimneys were still a luxury. The air smells of wood smoke, wet wool, and despair. People huddle around small fires that seem more symbolic than effective, hands outstretched toward the faint glow as if begging for mercy. This isn't just a season. This is the medieval winter, a full-body experience of discomfort, ingenuity, and mild hypothermia. It was the time of year when survival wasn't guaranteed, and when people developed a strange combination of fatalism and humor. Because when your hair freezes to your pillow, you can either cry or laugh. And medieval people somehow found ways to do both. Over the next 2 hours, we'll wander through this icy world together. We'll visit smoky cottages and echoing castles. We'll share a drink with monks trying to stay warm in stone monasteries and peek into noble halls where even the kings shivered in their crowns. We'll explore how people dressed, ate, worked, and somehow loved through the long, dark chill. So settle in. Let the fire crackle in your imagination. Feel the cold nip at your toes, but only just enough to appreciate your blanket. Because tonight, we're going back to a time when surviving December was an extreme sport, and you probably wouldn't have made it to January. Now let's begin, with the sun itself deciding that it's had enough of this nonsense. The first sign of winter wasn't snow, it was disappointment. Around mid-November, the medieval sun started phoning it in. It would rise late like a hungover rooster and set before anyone had finished their chores. You could almost hear it muttering, "Good luck, peasants," as it dipped behind the hills at 3 p.m. For most people, daylight became something you remembered. Villagers worked by the flicker of torches or the glow of the hearth. Shadows grew long and strange. The world turned monochrome, white, gray, and brown, with the occasional glint of frozen mud to break the aesthetic monotony. It was a winter Instagram filter no one asked for. Crops were gone, fields empty. What had once been a bustling landscape of plows and shouting farmhands was now still and silent. The only movement came from crows circling like tiny airborne critics, judging humanity's poor life choices. And in that eerie quiet, people started to wonder, what if the sun doesn't come back? Because back then, they didn't have the Weather Channel. They had superstition, stories, and anxiety. Some blamed witches, others blamed sin. A few optimistic souls claimed the sun was simply resting. Entire religious ceremonies were dedicated to coaxing it back. Candles lit, prayers muttered, and feasts held in its honor. The irony being that all the food for the feast had already frozen solid. Inside homes, people adjusted to the endless dusk. They woke when the rooster crowed, even though the rooster was clearly confused, and worked until they couldn't see their own hands. The line between day and night blurred, and time itself seemed to freeze, literally and metaphorically. For children, it was magical. For adults, it was exhausting. Imagine spending 16 hours of darkness trapped indoors with your entire family, 2 pigs, a few chickens, and one guy who never stops coughing. Privacy was not a concept. Personal space was a fantasy. The only entertainment came from storytelling, singing, or occasionally staring at the wall until you fell asleep. And yet somehow, life continued. The world didn't stop turning, just slowed to a crawl, wrapped in frost and patience. People adapted, as they always do. They stored food, they prayed, they complained, a universal human tradition, and they waited for spring. When you think about it, there's something beautifully human about that. The quiet endurance of ordinary people through extraordinary discomfort. So as you close your eyes and listen to the wind outside your imagination, remember, somewhere in some tiny medieval hut, a farmer is doing the same thing, listening to the wind, poking at a dying fire and muttering that maybe, just maybe, the sun has gone on vacation. In the medieval world, fire was everything. It was heat, light, cooking, safety, and morale, all bundled into one smoky miracle. But starting it, that was an Olympic event. Picture this. It's dawn. Well, sort of. The gray light is sneaking in through the cracks of your thatched roof. You're shivering so hard you sound like a percussion instrument, and the only thing standing between you and hypothermia is a sad pile of damp sticks. You strike a piece of flint against steel, click, 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 and a tiny spark falls onto your kindling. You blow gently, hopeful. The spark flares for a glorious half-second and dies in a puff of mockery. You try again, and again, and again. After about 20 minutes, you're muttering every medieval curse you know, which, fortunately, are all quite poetic. "By St. Lawrence's blistered toes," you shout, as another spark fizzles into nothing. Eventually, though, it catches. A wisp of smoke curls up like a sigh of divine approval. You feed it straw, then twigs, then a log that hisses and spits as if protesting the idea of being helpful. The fire grows, flickering, stubborn, beautiful. You hold your hands out to it, and immediately remember that smoke has opinions. It shifts directly into your face, filling your eyes with tears and your lungs with the taste of medieval barbecue. See, medieval fires were not contained. Chimneys, when they existed, were more decorative than functional. In most homes, the smoke simply rose into the rafters, then hung around like a socially awkward guest who refused to leave. Everything, clothes, hair, furniture, even the cat, smelled permanently of wood smoke. But no one complained. Because that smoke meant life. It meant warmth, cooking, company, and the illusion that winter could be defeated, one log at a time. Families gathered close around the hearth, not because it was cozy, but because it was necessary. The further you sat, the colder you got. Children fought for the best spot. Chickens wandered in to absorb the heat. The occasional goat would simply lie down right next to the flames, radiating contentment and methane in equal measure. And there was a strange kind of peace in it all. The crackle of wood, the faint glow against the dark, the soft murmur of voices. The fire was the heart of the home, literally and symbolically. When it died out, people spoke of it as if a family member had passed. The hearth went cold, they'd say, in tones of mourning. Of course, keeping it alive was a nightly battle. Someone had to get up before dawn to rekindle it, using embers carefully buried in ash to stay warm overnight. If the fire did go out completely, you had to humble yourself and ask a neighbor for a coal, a sort of pre-electricity version of borrowing a cup of sugar. Fire demanded attention, patience, and a fair bit of superstition. People whispered to it, fed it offerings, and believed it possessed a spirit of its own. In a world where cold could kill, a healthy fire was a little god in your living room. And so, as the snow fell outside and the wind rattled the shutters, life pulsed around that fragile flame. Smoke stung the eyes, embers popped like tiny stars, and in that simple dance of light and heat, the medieval night became, if not comfortable, at least survivable. You'd think that living in a castle would have its perks. Gold goblets, roaring fires, luxurious beds, servants with impeccable towel-folding skills. But medieval castles were basically giant stone refrigerators with flags on top. The walls were thick enough to survive a siege, but not thick enough to keep out the cold. Every draft found a way in, sneaking through arrow slits, beneath doors, or between stones. By January, even the torches shivered. Nobles layered themselves in furs and velvet, but still woke to find frost on their blankets. The great hall, supposedly the warmest place in the castle, was heated by a fire so big it could roast an ox, yet somehow managed to leave the upper gallery feeling like the Arctic. Heat, like money, stayed close to the few. Down below, in the servant quarters, it was worse. Servants slept in corridors next to storerooms, or sometimes directly above the kitchens just to steal the rising warmth. Their beds were stuffed with straw, their breath visible in the dark. At least they didn't have far to go when their noses froze. They could just roll over and defrost by the oven. And if you were a peasant, well, forget the castle entirely. Your home was likely a single-room hut with a thatched roof, wattle and daub walls, and a smoke hole that functioned about as well as a screen door on a submarine. The floor was dirt, sometimes covered with straw, sometimes covered with things that used to be straw. Families slept together on straw pallets, limbs tangled, hoping their combined body heat would fend off frostbite. If you were lucky, you had a pet. If you were really lucky, that pet was a cow. Not because you loved cows, but because they were portable radiators. Rain leaked in, wind howled through, and everything smelled faintly of damp wool and despair. The word insulation might as well have been science fiction. But there was one upside. Everyone was equally miserable. No one looked down on you for smelling like smoke or occasionally sharing your sleeping space with chickens. It was simply life. A drafty, muddy, smoke-filled, freezing life. But life nonetheless. And somehow, people made it work. They mended, patched, bundled, and laughed. They told stories, sang songs, and complained creatively. Humor became its own kind of insulation. Because when your house is technically a glorified barn, You learn to appreciate the poetry of suffering. So next time your central heating breaks and you think you've known cold, just remember, medieval folks lived in open-air igloos made of regret and still managed to get up the next morning to milk a frozen cow. If you were lucky enough to survive the cold, congratulations. You are now officially a host. Not for dinner parties, but for fleas, lice, and various uninvited guests who saw your body heat as a five-star resort. Medieval warmth came with terms and conditions, and one of them was, you will itch. Let's begin with the furs. Fur was life. Everyone wore it, from peasants wrapped in sheepskin to nobles draped in sable. If it had once been fluffy and breathing, someone in medieval Europe probably turned it into a garment. Fox, rabbit, cat, even squirrel. Nothing escaped the fashion trends of desperation. But the thing about fur is, it's cozy for everyone. Fleas loved it. Lice adored it. Fleas saw you as a mobile village, a buffet that walked and talked. And while you dreamed of warmth, they dreamed of multiplying. Every scratch of your head was essentially a medieval lullaby for them. Bathing wasn't much help either, because no one did it. Water was cold, often dirty, and believed to make you sick. People genuinely thought too much washing could open the pores and let in bad humors. So instead of soap and water, they opted for the strategic scrape and perfume method. The wealthy doused themselves in rose oil and powdered herbs. The poor just hoped no one noticed. And honestly, no one did, because everyone smelled equally awful. It was the great medieval equalizer. Sleeping arrangements didn't help the hygiene situation. Imagine 5 family members, 2 goats, and a chicken sharing one bed for warmth. Now imagine no one has changed their clothes in 3 weeks. You get the picture. Sheets, when they existed, were rarely washed, because laundry day in January meant breaking ice to reach the water. Even monasteries, those supposed havens of cleanliness, were not exactly sparkling. Monks bathed perhaps once a year, whether they needed it or not. They did, however, comb their hair daily, not out of vanity, but to collect the fleas in an orderly manner. People even believed that lice were good for you. Some monks argued that removing them was sinful. After all, they were God's creatures, just trying to make a living. Imagine that level of patience. You're scratching your scalp like it owes you money, and someone nearby is saying, "Ah, yes, brother," a sign of divine providence. And so, medieval warmth was a paradox. You could freeze to death without it, but you could itch to madness with it. People adapted by normalizing it. They laughed, they complained, and they invented creative insults involving lice. They even wove flea jokes into poetry, because nothing unites humanity like the shared misery of bug bites. Still, amid all the scratching and sniffing, there was something oddly human. People huddled close, laughed through the discomfort, and helped one another delouse when needed. Warmth was communal, both in spirit and in insect distribution. So the next time you wrap yourself in a clean blanket fresh from the dryer, take a deep breath. Smell that? That's luxury. In the Middle Ages, warmth came at a price, and that price was the constant sensation that your underwear was plotting against you. Welcome to the medieval kitchen in winter, where the menu is limited, the ingredients are uncooperative, and everything has the texture of regret. There was no refrigerator, but who needed one? The entire world was a refrigerator. The problem wasn't keeping food fresh. It was finding any food that hadn't turned into a medieval popsicle. Most people relied on preserved goods, salted meat, smoked fish, dried peas, and hard bread that could double as construction material. The average loaf of winter bread could chip a tooth and destroy morale in equal measure. Before eating, it had to be soaked in ale or broth to be chewable. Bon appétit. Meat, when available, was precious. Hunting was usually forbidden to peasants. It was the Lord's privilege. So they made do with whatever fell into a snare or wandered too close to the village. Rabbit stew? Maybe. Mystery stew? Definitely. Vegetables were scarce. Fresh greens were a distant memory. Turnips, onions, and cabbages ruled the winter table, their flavors somewhere between earthy and existential. Peasants often boiled everything into a single pot, creating the famous pottage, a thick stew that could feed a family for days. Each day it was reheated, reboiled, and reinterpreted until no one remembered what was originally in it. Salt was the true hero of winter. It kept meat from rotting and people from starving. Entire economies revolved around it. A sack of salt could be worth a fortune, and you needed a lot of it, because medieval preservation techniques were enthusiastic. In noble houses, things were only slightly better. They had more variety, dried fruits, imported spices, and barrels of wine, but even their meals suffered the same chill. Servants carried dishes across freezing halls, and by the time the roast reached the Lord's table, it was lukewarm at best and solid at worst. And then there was the joy of frozen ale. Ale was the lifeblood of medieval Europe. But in the depths of winter, barrels froze solid, leaving desperate drinkers to chip away at their liquid bread with knives. There are even records of people thawing ale in pots over the fire, a medieval version of microwaving your beer. Of course, not all winter eating was miserable. Feasts, when they happened, were events. The church calendar provided excuses for celebration. Christmas, Epiphany, and countless saints' days. On those rare nights, people would roast entire animals, drink themselves warm, and forget, for a few blissful hours, that tomorrow they'd be gnawing on cabbage again. But for the most part, eating was a chore. You didn't dine, you endured. Every bite was a victory against famine, every pot of stew a small rebellion against the cold. And yet, there was a strange coziness to it all. The smell of smoke and broth, the sound of bubbling stew, the soft murmur of family around the hearth. It was survival with flavor. Sparse, smoky, slightly questionable flavor, but flavor nonetheless. So, if you ever complain that your soup's too cold, just remember, somewhere in the year 1320, a peasant is gnawing on a turnip that's literally frozen solid, whispering a prayer that spring will come before his teeth give up. Ah, morning in the medieval world. The rooster crows, the frost glitters, and the first thing you reach for isn't coffee, it's beer. Yes, beer for breakfast wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was hydration with benefits. The water back then was more of a death wish than a drink. Wells could be contaminated. Rivers ran with everything from dead animals to medieval secrets, and boiling water was too much effort before sunrise. So people brewed weak beer instead, small ale, a liquid safer than water and barely alcoholic. Children drank it. Monks brewed it. Peasants lived on it. If you were thirsty, you didn't ask for water. You asked, "Is there ale?" And the answer, thankfully, was almost always yes. But brewing beer in winter, that was an art form. Yeast didn't like the cold, and fermentation was moody. Brewers had to keep their barrels close to the fire, monitoring them like newborns. Some even sang to their brew, whispering encouragements to the yeast. Because when you live in a freezing hut, you'll talk to anything that might help. The result was a cloudy, slightly sour, bread-flavored drink that kept you alive and mildly cheerful. It wasn't the IPA of your dreams, but it was calorie-dense, nutritious, and slightly numbing to the existential dread of January. In monasteries, the monks were basically medieval baristas. They took beer-making seriously, precise, methodical, and blessedly quiet. Some brewed strong ales for feast days and weak ones for fasting. Their slogan could have been, Ora et labora et lager. Beer was so central to life that wages were often partly paid in ale. Farmhands got their daily quota after work, a liquid paycheck that kept spirits high and productivity moderate. And because winter work was scarce, the local tavern became the village's social hub. Inside, smoke hung thick as conversation. The ale was warmish, the benches wobbly, and someone always played a lute badly in the corner. Gossip flowed faster than the beer itself. Who was marrying whom? Who was behind on taxes? And whether the miller's cow was possessed. It usually wasn't. For the wealthy, beer was sometimes swapped for wine. Imported, expensive, and smugly sipped from silver cups. But even kings drank ale daily. It was a universal truth. No matter your station, the cold was easier to bear with something fermented in your cup. Of course, drinking all day had consequences. Hangovers were rampant, productivity questionable, and some sermons dedicated entire passages to warning against the sin of drunken sloth. But you can't blame people. When your home temperature averages refrigerator, sometimes you just need a buzz to get through it. So next time someone tells you not to drink before noon, remind them. In the Middle Ages, that was breakfast, and no one complained. Now, with your imaginary pint in hand, take a long sip, feel that cozy buzz, and imagine the warmth spreading through your frozen medieval soul. Because soon, we're going indoors. And indoors was somehow worse. Step inside a medieval home in winter and take a deep breath. Now cough. Congratulations. You've just participated in the annual Indoor Smoke Festival, also known as daily life. Without proper chimneys, most houses had an open hearth in the center of the floor. The smoke was supposed to rise, find its way out through a hole in the roof, and politely disappear. Instead, it filled the room, bounced off the rafters, and clung to every surface like an over-enthusiastic ghost. The result? A cozy, choking haze that never quite cleared. People's eyes watered constantly. Coughing was the soundtrack of winter. You didn't just smell of smoke, you were smoke. Everything, from your hair to your bread, carried that distinct aroma of medieval barbecue. It's no wonder that paintings of peasants always look slightly dazed. They weren't sad. They were just lightheaded. The walls turned black, the ceilings dripped soot, and rafters collected a thick layer of grime that occasionally dropped onto your stew like seasoning from above. No one complained. It was extra flavor. Children learned early to keep low to the ground, where the air was marginally breathable. Pets did too. Dogs, cats, chickens, and humans all huddled together in this smoky microclimate, blinking through tears, united in mutual suffering. You might ask, why not just build a chimney? Great question. Some people did. The wealthier homes and castles had rudimentary flues, but for most, a chimney was as rare as personal space, and early chimneys were notoriously bad at their job, either sucking all the heat out or catching fire entirely. You had a 50-50 chance of survival either way, so people adapted. They learned to live in the haze. Smoke kept insects away, and even preserved thatched roofs by coating them in tar. It also gave the home its signature color palette: black, darker black, and was this on fire? Clothing, too, was permanently infused with the smell. Travelers could tell which village you were from by your particular blend of oak, pine, and desperation. Medieval fashion didn't come with perfume. It came with passive smoking. Even meals carried that smoky charm. Bread baked near the fire absorbed it. Stew simmered in soot-seasoned pots. And when guests arrived, it was considered polite to apologize only once before ignoring the problem entirely. At night, the smoke lingered low, creeping across the floor like a living fog. People woke up coughing, rubbed their eyes, and immediately set about making more smoke. Because the only thing worse than choking on it was freezing without it. It's a strange kind of comfort, isn't it? That soft orange glow, the flicker of firelight through haze, the sound of logs popping. It was misery, but it was shared misery. And in that shared space, families told stories, sang softly, and survived together. So as you listen now, imagine the crackling fire, the lazy swirl of smoke rising toward the rafters, and the way it fills the air like an ancient lullaby. A smoky, slightly toxic lullaby, but a lullaby nonetheless. The idea that people in the Middle Ages hibernated through winter is tempting, but false. Sadly, medieval society did not believe in seasonal rest. If you could move, you could work. And if you couldn't move, someone would find you a smaller, colder job. Winter didn't stop the grind. It simply made everything worse. Outside, the fields were frozen solid. The plow was useless, the soil asleep. But there was always wood to chop, repairs to make, and livestock to feed. A peasant's winter day began in darkness, trudging through the snow with tools in one hand and existential dread in the other. Woodcutters were the true heroes and sufferers of the season. They rose early to fell trees in biting winds, hauling logs that seemed heavier with every step. Firewood wasn't optional. If you didn't have enough stacked before the first frost, you were doomed to spend February regretting your life choices. For others, winter meant mending. Clothes were patched, tools repaired, roofs rethatched with whatever wasn't frozen stiff. The village blacksmith hammered away in a workshop so cold, the metal rang like a church bell. Even spinning and weaving, those supposedly indoor tasks, were exercises in numb-fingered persistence. Animals needed constant care. Cows had to be milked before dawn, sheep checked for frostbite, and chickens coaxed into laying eggs despite their visible disapproval. Farmers shuffled between barns, breaking ice in troughs and muttering curses creative enough to make Shakespeare blush. And then there was bread making, the cruel joke of winter. Grain supplies dwindled, mills froze, and ovens smoked. The daily loaf was often half barley, half sawdust, unintentionally. Still, baking was a ritual of hope. Even a flat, rock-hard loaf meant continuity. If the weather turned cruel, and it often did, work simply shifted indoors. You might spend the day carving tools, repairing harnesses, or churning butter until your arms fell off. There was no day off, only less daylight. For nobles and their servants, winter work took a different form. Servants still rose before dawn to light fires, fetch water, and polish things no one could see in the dark. Lords spent their time hunting, because nothing says wealth like chasing a half-frozen deer through the snow while wearing 20 kilos of fur. And the monks? They copied manuscripts by candlelight, ink freezing in their quills, fingers cramping around each letter. Every page of medieval scripture is a miracle of endurance, and possibly mild frostbite. But amid all the aching joints and numb hands, there was rhythm. The shared struggle of keeping life running created a strange kind of satisfaction. Every chopped log, every mended boot, every smoky loaf of bread was proof of survival. People worked, grumbled, laughed, and endured. Because that's what humans do, even when their toes have gone on strike. So as you imagine this scene, the steady ring of a hammer, the crunch of boots on snow, the sigh of wind against wood, remember that for medieval folk, work was warmth. Motion kept them alive, and stopping, well, that was for the unlucky ones. Now this may sound strange, but in winter, the line between barn and bedroom became negotiable. You see, medieval heating technology boiled down to one concept: body heat. And if you wanted to survive the winter, you didn't waste it. Which meant that sometimes your roommate had horns. In many peasant cottages, the family's animals, cows, sheep, goats, and chickens, shared the same living space. Not out of affection, but necessity. A cow could raise the room temperature by a few degrees, which might mean the difference between alive and frozen curiosity. So yes, when a peasant said, "I'm sleeping with the cows tonight," it wasn't a euphemism. It was a survival strategy. Picture it: a low, smoky hut filled with the sounds of snoring humans, shuffling hooves, and the occasional chicken indignantly protesting the draft. The air was warm, yes, but also thick, a fragrant blend of hay, sweat, smoke, and barnyard perfume. And somehow, this was cozy. Children slept pressed against their mothers, who were pressed against the cow, who was pressed against the wall. Everyone radiated heat into everyone else. Privacy was not part of the design. At dawn, the animals were milked right where they stood, and the family began their day already halfway to exhaustion. The straw was flattened, the air foggy, and the chickens always seemed to be judging everyone. Even wealthier households weren't immune to this arrangement. Castles had separate stables, sure, but dogs and smaller animals often roamed freely. Cats were welcome for pest control, and hounds slept by the hearth. The only difference between rich and poor was the amount of hay stuck to their clothes. Monks, meanwhile, faced their own winter companions, mice. Monastic dormitories were drafty, cold, and crumb-filled from nightly bread rations. Mice scurried through the blankets like tiny, judgmental landlords collecting rent in crumbs. And yet, this strange cohabitation created bonds. People depended on their animals for warmth, food, and company. They talked to them, thanked them, and occasionally apologized to them after stepping in something unpleasant. There's even historical record of farmers naming their cows affectionately, often after saints, and speaking to them as equals, because in winter, those cows were family. Of course, it wasn't all harmony. A startled goat could ruin a night's sleep, and chickens had no sense of boundaries. But somehow, it worked. Humans and animals shared space, warmth, and an understanding. We're all trying to survive this nonsense together. So when you imagine the medieval winter night, don't picture solitude by a quiet fire. Picture a crowded, snoring, steaming room full of life. Messy, noisy, smelly, but alive. And as you drift off to sleep, be grateful for your electric heating, your fluffy duvet, and your distinct lack of mooing beside the bed. Because once upon a time, the warmest lullaby you could hear on a winter's night was a cow snoring gently in the dark. Imagine waking up in a freezing hut, realizing your toes feel suspiciously less there than usual. Congratulations, you're now a medieval medical emergency. In a time before thermometers, antibiotics, or even the concept of germs, the medieval approach to medicine was a fascinating mix of guesswork, prayer, and mild torture. If your fingers turned blue, the local healer would solemnly diagnose it as an imbalance of humors, then prescribe something wildly unhelpful, like drink warm goat's milk while chanting to Saint Blaise. Frostbite wasn't fully understood, but that didn't stop anyone from trying to fix it. Common remedies included rubbing the frozen area with snow to wake the flesh, dipping it in warm wine, or smearing it with goose fat and hope. If all else failed, you'd be told to bleed it out, because clearly your problem was too much blood. Doctors, and I use that term loosely, followed the teachings of Galen, a Greek physician who'd been dead for over 1,000 years, but was still running the show. According to him, the body was ruled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Cold weather made your phlegm dominant. The cure? Hot drinks, leeches, and occasionally setting something on fire near you. Leeches were the medieval multi-tool. Got a fever? Leech it. Got frostbite? Leech it. Feeling sad? Definitely leech it. It's a miracle anyone survived long enough to complain about it. But perhaps the most impressive medical intervention was amputation. Surgery, performed with unwashed hands and a dull knife, often took place in someone's kitchen. There were no anesthetics, just strong ale and a firm friend holding you down. And because winter infections were almost guaranteed, your odds of survival were about 50-50, slightly lower if your surgeon was nearsighted. Herbal remedies offered slightly better odds. People brewed teas from elderflower, rosemary, and yarrow, believing they could restore warmth to the soul. Some rubbed crushed garlic on wounds. Others prayed over them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it smelled like failure. Monasteries doubled as hospitals, and monks did their best, which in fairness was better than most. They kept records, grew medicinal herbs, and treated patients with a mix of science, scripture, and good intentions. Their infirmaries were cold but clean, and the patients were at least prayed for regularly. Still, winter was cruel to the human body. Frostbite, respiratory illness, and malnutrition were relentless. But even in the bleakest times, people had humor. Jokes about losing toes, about walking less this winter, about how even saints probably sneezed. Laughter, oddly enough, was the most effective medicine they had. So, as you picture those trembling hands over a smoky fire, imagine the quiet resilience. People doing what they could, with what they had, against odds that make your sniffle seem like luxury. And if your fingers are warm right now, take a moment to appreciate that. Because in medieval Europe, warmth wasn't comfort, it was miracle. Ah, snow. Beautiful, silent, and, if you were a medieval peasant, an absolute nightmare. In fairy tales, snow means magic. In medieval reality, it meant roofs collapsing, roads vanishing, and a new round of cursing in Latin. When the first flakes fell, everyone braced themselves. Travel became nearly impossible. Carts got stuck, horses refused to move, and the few brave souls who tried to cross the countryside often ended up in ditches or poems. Messages stopped arriving, markets closed, and entire villages became tiny, self-contained snow globes of mild panic. Still, snow had its moments of beauty. At night, under a full moon, the world glowed, every roof frosted, every tree silvered, every field shining with quiet stillness. It was the kind of sight that made poets write and peasants mutter, "Yes, lovely, now my door won't open." Children, of course, loved it. They turned frozen misery into play. They built snowmen, crude lumps of ice with sticks for arms and occasionally a turnip for a nose. They slid on frozen ponds, chased each other with handfuls of snow, and probably invented snowball warfare centuries before it was banned in schools. Adults were less enthusiastic. Snow meant more work. Paths had to be cleared with shovels made of wood. Livestock had to be dug out of drifts, and roofs, those charming thatched ones, had to be beaten gently from the inside to stop them caving in. It was a team effort. One person outside, one person inside, both praying for survival. There were no plows, no salt trucks, no cheerful weather reports, just people improvising, throwing ashes on ice for traction, using straw to line slippery roads, or tying bits of cloth around their shoes for grip. Medieval snow gear was experimental. Still, even in the chaos, there was something almost joyful about it. Snow brought people together, literally, because they were stuck. Neighbors shared fires, food, and stories. Taverns filled early, filled faster. And as the night fell, the sound of laughter and clinking mugs echoed through the frozen air. Sometimes the village priest would organize processions, asking God to spare us from more white suffering. Other times, people simply shrugged and said, "At least it covers the mud." When spring finally came and the snow melted, it revealed the medieval aftermath. Lost tools, broken carts, the occasional frozen chicken, and the eternal question of how did we survive that? And somehow they did, every year, through every storm, because under all the hardship, medieval people had one unshakable skill: endurance. So as you imagine that snow-blanketed world, the muffled silence, the crunch of boots, the glow of a distant hearth, breathe in deeply. Feel that cold that bites but doesn't quite hurt, that stillness that makes you small and content. Because in the heart of every winter, medieval or modern, there's the same truth. It's cold, it's hard, and it's fleeting. And when it finally melts, you're left with stories, and maybe a turnip-nosed snowman slowly becoming soup. The medieval night was not like ours. There were no streetlights, no glowing screens, no distant hum of cars. When darkness came, it fell, thick, complete, absolute. It was a living thing that swallowed the world whole. In winter, that darkness ruled for 16 hours at a time. People moved slower, spoke softer, and lit candles as if they were tiny suns. The flicker of a single flame could make a room feel like a universe. Sleep itself was different. It came in shifts. Historians call it segmented sleep. People would go to bed soon after dusk, wake up sometime around midnight, then do quiet things, pray, talk, make repairs, or visit neighbors with lanterns glowing like fireflies, before going back to sleep until dawn. The hours between those two sleeps were special, peaceful, mysterious. Outside, the village lay silent except for the occasional dog barking or the sigh of wind through the thatch. Inside, people whispered stories or sat in the flickering firelight, staring into the orange glow as if it could reveal something beyond warmth, something eternal. For many, these midnight hours were a time of reflection. They called it the watch. Monks used it for prayer. Farmers used it for thinking. Lovers used it for, well, other things. And sometimes people swore that in those deep hours, when the world seemed paused, they could hear things, whispers, footsteps, the sound of the old gods still walking in the dark. Candles burned low. Shadows danced on the walls. Every creak of the house sounded louder. Every gust of wind felt personal. It was easy to believe the night had eyes. Even noble households, protected by stone walls and guards, weren't free from unease. The servants slept near doorways, clutching crosses. Cats paced restlessly. And somewhere, deep in the corridors, the fire crackled just enough to remind you were not entirely alone. But there was comfort in this stillness, too. The stars stretched bright and cold above. A sky clearer than anything we know today. People learned the constellations, not for romance, but for survival. The stars were clocks, calendars, and silent companions through the endless winter nights. And slowly, as the hours crept on, the second sleep arrived. Heavy, dream-thick, and deep. People drifted off again, wrapped in wool and silence, the fire fading to embers, their dreams filled with snow, warmth, and the strange, quiet beauty of surviving another night. So as you listen now, imagine that stillness. No hum, no light, no noise. Just breath, fire, and darkness. The kind that makes you feel small, safe, and utterly beautifully sleepy. When nights stretch long and cold, the imagination stretches with them. And in medieval Europe, that imagination had teeth. The dark wasn't empty. It was crowded. With spirits, demons, restless souls, and creatures that wandered where the light refused to go. The winter wind howled like voices, trees creaked like whispers, and people were certain that something unseen was always watching from the shadows. Every region had its own nightmares. In the Alps, there was the Perchten, masked spirits who roamed the snowy nights to punish the lazy. In Scandinavia, people spoke of the Draugr, undead warriors haunting their burial mounds. In England, there were the will-o'-the-wisps, lights in the marshes said to lure travelers to their doom. Even ordinary sounds had supernatural explanations. The cracking of ice, a frost demon walking the river, a creaking door, a lost soul looking for shelter, a sudden chill, the breath of a ghost passing through. And because the medieval mind saw divine meaning in everything, the church got involved. Priests warned that demons were strongest in winter, when human hearts were weakest. The devil, they said, loved the cold, for it was the opposite of God's warmth. To ward off evil, people burned blessed herbs, hung iron over doors, and carved protective symbols into their homes. Candles were kept burning through the longest nights, not just for light, but to remind the darkness it wasn't in charge. Animals, too, were thought to sense the supernatural. If your dog refused to go outside, if your cow mooed at nothing, if your cat stared too long into the corner, well, best start praying. But not all winter spirits were malevolent. Some were mischievous, even kind. The Tomte in Nordic lands, little household guardians who watched over families and livestock. Feed them porridge at Christmas, and they'd protect your home, forget, and Well, accidents happened. Folklore wasn't just entertainment, it was survival psychology. When the night stretched endlessly and the cold crept into your bones, you needed stories to explain it. Fear made sense of the senseless. It gave shape to the unseen, and in that strange way, it comforted as much as it frightened. Imagine it now. The village silent, the wind howling, a candle flickering as someone tells, a story of spirits wandering the snow. The listeners sit close, their faces glowing orange, their eyes wide but safe, because fear, like warmth, was something they shared. The snow outside glistens under the moon. The wind sighs against the shutters. And in that moment, the medieval mind drifts between worlds, half in faith, half in fear, and entirely certain that something beyond the door is listening too. So if tonight you hear a soft creak or a whisper in the dark, don't worry. It's just history, brushing past on its way to somewhere colder. If there was one bright spark in the long medieval winter, it was Yuletide, a time when people pretended to be warm, full, and joyful, even if they were mostly cold, hungry, and slightly drunk. Christmas in the Middle Ages was less about presents and more about presence, namely, being present at the only feast you might see for months. For one brief, glorious stretch of days, people threw caution, calories, and occasionally common sense to the wind. The timing was perfect. By late December, the harvest was long over, and whatever food you'd managed to store was beginning to look suspicious. The salted pork was running low. The bread was hard enough to qualify as weaponry. And the vegetables had all merged into something unidentifiable. So naturally, everyone decided, let's eat it all at once. The result was a strange, wonderful gamble. For nobles, the great hall transformed into a theater of abundance. Roasted boar with apples in its mouth, pies shaped like castles, and rivers of wine flowing through the laughter. Minstrels sang, jesters juggled, and someone inevitably fell asleep in the pudding. For peasants, the celebration was smaller but no less heartfelt. A bit of meat, maybe a mug of ale shared with neighbors in a smoky cottage. The fire crackled, songs were sung, and for a few blessed hours, everyone forgot that the pantry was now empty. But beneath the joy lurked a quiet calculation. How long until hunger returned? Because winter wasn't done, January waited, cold and unforgiving. And after the feasting came the reckoning. The lean months where meat day became a memory and soup turned philosophical. Still, Yuletide was sacred. Both church and folklore wrapped it in meaning. The 12 days of Christmas were filled with superstition. Animals could talk on Christmas Eve. The dead could visit their homes. And whoever was the first to enter your house after midnight determined your luck for the year. Hopefully, it wasn't the tax collector. Gift-giving existed, though it was modest. A loaf of bread, a candle, or if you were truly loved, a chunk of bacon. Children received small treats, though mostly they were just excited that their parents were slightly less grumpy than usual. And then came Twelfth Night, the chaotic finale. Lords and ladies swapped roles with servants for a day. Mock kings were crowned, and ale flowed freely enough to make everyone forget who was actually in charge. Afterward, silence returned. The laughter faded, the fires dimmed, and people counted their supplies with nervous eyes. The feast had ended, but its warmth lingered, in bellies, in memory, and in the faint hope that somehow spring would find its way back. Because in the medieval winter, joy was rationed, and everyone knew it. But when it arrived, Even briefly, it burned brighter than any hearth. So as you picture that glowing hall, the music, the laughter, the snow outside, imagine the flicker of gratitude in every heart. It wasn't just a party. It was proof that they were still alive. While peasants cursed the cold and nobles distracted themselves with banquets, monks had a different approach to winter. Discipline. Inside the stone walls of monasteries, life continued in perfect, chilly order. Bells rang before dawn, calling the brothers to prayer. They shuffled from their beds, thin mattresses stuffed with straw, and wrapped themselves in coarse wool habits that never quite dried. The air in the cloisters was still and icy. Their breath rose like incense. Feet padded softly on the cold flagstones as they gathered in the chapel for matins, the night prayer. Candles flickered, voices murmured Latin hymns, and somewhere in the distance, the wind whispered through the arches. Monastic life was built on silence, humility, and routine, all excellent virtues, but terrible heating systems. Fires were allowed only in a few places: the kitchen, the infirmary, and sometimes the scriptorium where monks copied manuscripts. Everywhere else, you relied on layers of clothing, internal peace, and a willingness to suffer gracefully. The scriptorium, in particular, was an endurance test disguised as scholarship. Imagine trying to copy the Book of Psalms while your ink freezes in the pot and your quill hand goes numb. Every letter took effort. Every word was a triumph of faith over frostbite. Some manuscripts still bear the faint smudge of a monk's cold breath or a tiny note in the margin. My fingers are stiff. Pray for me. Meals were simple and mostly warm: soup, bread, and beer, but eaten in silence with readings from Scripture. Even chewing too loudly could be a sin of distraction. Still, there was comfort in the rhythm. Prayer, work, food, prayer, rest. The cold became part of the discipline, something to endure rather than escape. Yet even monks found creative ways to cope. Some tucked warm stones into their robes before bed. Others paced the cloisters during prayer to keep blood flowing. And there were whispered rumors of monasteries where the brothers took turns sitting closest to the kitchen door, under the guise of guarding the bread. For all their austerity, monasteries were islands of stability. Their stone walls, though frigid, were steady. Their fires never went out completely. Travelers often sought shelter within, and the monks, bound by charity, offered soup, a blanket, and a blessing, the medieval equivalent of room service, minus the heating. In their silence, they found something profound: the stillness beneath the hardship. Winter became a teacher of patience, humility, and perspective. Where peasants saw misery, monks saw meditation. Where others saw endless night, they saw time to pray. And perhaps that's why so many medieval songs and poems about winter came from monasteries. The cold stripped life to its essentials: food, faith, and survival, and left behind something clear and eternal. So as you imagine them now, cloaked in gray, candles glowing, voices echoing softly through frozen halls, take a breath. In the quiet of their world, you might just hear it too. Not the sound of suffering, but the whisper of peace in the cold. Let's talk about a topic medieval chronicles tend to skip politely. Because if there's one thing history books forget to mention, it's that nature calls no matter how cold it gets. In winter, this was less a quick trip to the bathroom and more a spiritual test of courage. Peasants had outdoor latrines. simple pits with wooden seats, often positioned a respectable distance from the home. That distance, however, became a journey of peril when the temperature dropped below freezing. Stepping outside meant braving the dark, the wind, and occasionally a startled goose that had decided to claim the latrine as its winter residence. So, many households turned to a more portable solution, the chamber pot. A ceramic, sometimes metal bowl that lived discreetly under the bed, ready for emergencies, midnight needs, or mornings when frostbite seemed a worse fate than embarrassment. But winter brought new challenges. Chamber pots froze. Their contents froze. And if you forgot to empty it before dawn, you might find yourself staring at what historians delicately refer to as a situation. Nobles had it only slightly better. Castles featured garderobes, small rooms jutting out over the moat with a hole in the stone floor. Gravity and cold air handled the rest. Unfortunately, the drafts were legendary. Sitting there was less like relief and more like conducting a science experiment in hypothermia. The smell didn't help either. Freezing temperatures preserved everything. So instead of vanishing, the stench lingered politely, waiting for spring to reintroduce itself with enthusiasm. Monks and nuns, in their serene wisdom, had communal latrines, long stone benches with evenly spaced holes and running water beneath. But when that water froze, even divine patience had limits. One monk in the 13th century actually recorded in his journal, "May God forgive me, for I swore at the cold." And yet, as unpleasant as it sounds, people made do. They adapted. Chamber pots were lined with straw or ashes to mask odors. Garderobes were sprinkled with herbs. Children were tasked with emptying them. The medieval equivalent of an unpaid internship. Some even turned the problem into a mild form of entertainment. Folk humor was full of toilet jokes. Travelers told tales of the man whose bottom froze to the seat, and inns competed for the title of least dangerous privy in January. The truth is, when your entire world is cold and uncomfortable, you have to laugh at something, even if that something is your own frozen dignity. So, as you lie in your warm bed tonight, take a deep breath, preferably not through your nose if you're imagining too vividly, and be grateful for your heated bathroom. Because once upon a time, every medieval morning began not with coffee, but with the quiet sound of someone muttering, "Not again," over a block of ice that used to be their chamber pot. Winter wasn't all misery and chamber pots. It also had romance. Granted, it was the kind of romance that required several layers of clothing, a sturdy immune system, and zero expectations of personal space. Picture a medieval village in January. The air smells of wood smoke and wet wool. Everyone's bundled up like walking laundry piles. Flirting under these conditions was subtle. Eye contact across the alehouse, maybe a compliment shouted over the sound of a creaking door. "Nice fur hat." "Thanks. It used to be my cousin's." Courtship slowed down in winter, but it didn't stop. Long nights encouraged storytelling, song, and the occasional glance that lingered just a little too long. Couples met by firelight, voices low, while everyone else pretended to be asleep. The fire popped, the wind sighed, and somewhere a cow shifted in the corner. The medieval equivalent of romantic background music. For nobles, winter love was more theatrical. The castle halls echoed with dances and feasts. Poets recited verses of courtly love. Devotion so pure, it often required no physical contact whatsoever, which was convenient when everyone was wearing 8 layers of fabric. Knights wrote love letters on parchment, sealed with wax, and occasionally spelled the lady's name correctly. Peasants, on the other hand, had simpler traditions. Winter weddings were common, partly because crops were dormant and there was finally time for celebration, and partly because it was too cold for anyone to object for long. Guests gathered around fires, drinking ale, stomping their feet, and wishing the couple many children and no frostbite. Love itself, though, had to adapt to the cold. Hand-holding, risky, lips practically suicidal. One ill-timed kiss outdoors could result in the world's first documented case of lip frost. So affection moved indoors, by the hearth, under blankets, surrounded by the smell of smoke and stew. And there, in the dim glow, something beautiful happened. For all the hardship and hunger, people still found warmth in each other. They sang, they touched, they whispered, they promised. In a world where comfort was rare, love was the comfort. Even monks weren't immune to winter's tug on the heart. Some wrote poetry so tender it bordered on scandalous, carefully disguised as metaphors for divine love, of course. The chill of the body, they said, revealed the warmth of the soul. So yes, medieval romance was real. Raw, imperfect, practical, and occasionally chaperoned by livestock. But maybe that made it more genuine. When you have nothing but firelight and faith, every smile matters more. Every touch is a miracle. Every shared blanket is a vow. So as you settle deeper into yours tonight, think of them. 2 people huddled together in the flickering light, laughing softly while the wind howls outside. Because love, even back then, was the only thing strong enough to melt a medieval winter. When the world was quiet and the fields lay under snow, it was the church bells that reminded people life was still happening. The sound carried for miles, clear, solemn, and strangely comforting. In January's still air, it was like hearing hope made of bronze. Bells didn't just mark time, they gave shape to the endless gray. They called people to mass, to prayer, to work, to weddings, to funerals. In a world without clocks, the bell was the heartbeat of the community. Its tolling rose above the wind, echoing across the frozen fields, through villages where even dogs had stopped barking to listen. At dawn, the bell called the living. At dusk, it mourned the dead. And in between, it marked the slow rhythm of survival. Inside the churches, the air was colder than outside. Vast stone halls that trapped every draft, but none of the heat. Parishioners shuffled in, wrapped in wool and hope, breath rising like incense. The flicker of candles painted gold halos on cracked walls. The priest spoke in Latin, his voice echoing against pillars. Most of his congregation didn't understand a word, but they nodded anyway, because it wasn't about comprehension. It was about comfort. The ritual itself warmed them, even if the air didn't. January was the season of penitence. People prayed for spring, for food, for mercy. They confessed sins that ranged from thinking impure thoughts to stealing turnips from the neighbor's cart. Everyone had something to confess, especially the turnip thieves. For the clergy, it was an exhausting month. Priests traveled between parishes, often trudging miles through snow to deliver blessings, hear confessions, and remind everyone that eternal salvation was still worth freezing for. Sometimes the bell tolled not for mass, but for warning, of illness, fire, or worst of all, famine. Its deep tone could mean comfort or dread, depending on the day. People listened carefully, The difference between joy and disaster was often just a few beats. And yet, even in the darkest winters, the church provided more than faith. It offered rhythm, order, and community. Festivals punctuated the gloom. Epiphany, Candlemas, the feast of St. Agnes. Each one an excuse to gather, light candles, and pretend for a few hours that spring was closer than it really was. Music filled the air. The organ wheezed. Voices rose. It didn't matter that half the choir was out of tune. They were united in purpose. Singing, after all, was just praying louder. When the final bell rang at night, its echo lingered long in the silence. People crossed themselves, banked their fires, and crawled into bed, soothed by the sound. The bell was both a reminder and a promise that even in the coldest months, the world was still turning. And maybe, if you listened closely, it sounded a bit like spring waiting to begin. If peasants endured winter through sheer grit and monks through faith, nobles survived through denial. Castles, impressive as they looked, were freezing. Great halls echoed with the clatter of spoons and the sound of chattering teeth. Stone walls held heat about, as well as a colander holds soup. Yet somehow, the aristocracy convinced themselves they were living in luxury. They draped furs over everything: chairs, beds, tables, pets, visiting relatives. They wore layers of wool and velvet so thick they could barely move. Entire fashion trends developed just to hide goosebumps. A nobleman's winter outfit could include 3 tunics, 2 cloaks, gloves, and a hat shaped like a small mountain. The women fared no better. Long gowns, underskirts, and sleeves so wide they could double as emergency blankets. Getting dressed was basically armor for frost. At night, they retreated to their chambers, vast rooms with ceilings so high the heat gave up halfway. 4-poster beds were their salvation, wrapped in thick curtains to trap warmth, and sometimes servants if you weren't careful. Bed-warming pans, metal trays filled with hot coals, were slid between the sheets before bedtime, turning sleep into a delicate dance between comfort and third-degree burns. Despite the luxury, discomfort was universal. The castle dogs often slept on their master's feet. Servants rotated through the night to keep fires fed. And everyone pretended it was all perfectly splendid, because nobility, above all else, required optimism or delusion. Feasting was their main defense against misery. The great hall blazed with torches and laughter, though most of the heat escaped through the roof. Tables groaned under roasted meats, pies, and jellies shaped like heraldic beasts. Wine flowed like melted courage. But beneath the glitter, everyone was freezing. The musicians' fingers stuck to their instruments. The jester's bells went silent because his hat had frozen stiff. Even the roast swan cooled before it reached the high table. Still, appearances mattered. The ability to look serene while quietly developing frostbite was practically a noble virtue. Guests complimented the decor. Tapestries depicting warm Mediterranean scenes. Purely aspirational artwork for people who hadn't felt sunlight since October. Even bathing was a performance. Warm baths were rare and required heating barrels of water over open fires. Nobles bathed maybe once a month, accompanied by attendants and scented oils to disguise the effort. Afterward, they'd shiver in luxury while insisting they felt refreshed. To pass the time, they played games, listened to troubadours, and complained about the draft. The cold became part of the conversation, an elegant problem shared among elegant sufferers. And yet, for all the absurdity, there was something strangely admirable about their stubborn grace. Wrapped in layers of fabric, feasting beneath frozen banners, pretending to be comfortable, they were acting out civilization itself. Because that's what being noble really meant in winter. Not being warm, but pretending so convincingly that everyone else wanted to believe it too. So as you imagine those lords and ladies tonight, smiling through chattering teeth, goblets raised in frozen cheer, remember, comfort is temporary, but dignity apparently lasts until frostbite. Spring never arrived in the Middle Ages. It crept in, cautiously, suspiciously, as if unsure whether it was welcome. After months of frost, the first signs were small. The drip of melting ice from rooftops, the squelch of mud underfoot, the faint, almost forgotten sound of birds arguing about real estate in the trees. People blinked into the sunlight, like confused moles rediscovering the concept of color. At first there was joy. The snow melted, rivers flowed, and everything seemed alive again. Then the smell hit. Because medieval winter didn't make things disappear, it just put them on pause. And when the thaw came, so did everything it had politely hidden. Spoiled food, forgotten waste piles, and the occasional unfortunate animal that had decided to nap for eternity under a snowdrift. Villages became mud baths, roads turned to soup, boots were devoured by the earth. Even the pigs looked offended. The air was thick with the perfume of spring, equal parts manure, mold, and relief. But no one cared. The cold was gone, and the world was alive again. Children played in puddles. Farmers checked their fields, muttering to themselves like suspicious landlords. Women aired out blankets that hadn't seen sunlight since last harvest. Of course, the thaw also meant work. Everything had to be repaired, rebuilt, and redug. Fences had collapsed, roofs leaked, and the roads needed to be cleared of whatever winter had decided to store there. People patched walls, sharpened plows, and celebrated the miraculous return of mud as if it were a luxury good. The rivers swelled with melted snow, flooding lowlands and sometimes carrying away whole bridges, and, if local legends are to be believed, the occasional overly curious goose. Fishermen rejoiced, then immediately complained about the cold water. For nobles, spring meant hunting season. They rode out into dripping forests, eager to chase something that wasn't an existential dread. Courtiers swapped fur for linen, pretending they hadn't spent 3 months huddled near the fireplace muttering about drafts. The monks saw it differently. To them, the thaw was spiritual renewal. God's yearly reminder that even misery ends eventually. They sang hymns of rebirth, cleaned their cloisters, and looked forward to Lent, which was like winter, but voluntary. And then came planting season. Farmers filled the fields, bending to the soil that once betrayed them. The rhythm of life returned, creaking but determined. Chickens laid eggs again. The cows, now free from house arrest, wandered the fields in bovine bliss. The thaw smelled awful, yes, but it was the scent of survival, the scent of things continuing. So as the world turned muddy and bright, medieval people took a deep breath of that pungent air and smiled. Because even if it reeked of decay, it also smelled unmistakably like hope. When logic freezes, superstition warms the soul, and in the medieval winter, logic was usually busy shivering in a corner. Cold weather brought all kinds of strange beliefs. a magical mix of fear, faith, and my neighbor said so. If your fire smoked too much, it meant witches were near. If the wind changed suddenly, the devil was stretching. If you sneezed more than twice, congratulations. You were cursed, possessed, or simply allergic to poverty. Every village had its own folklore. In some places, people burned herbs in the hearth to invite spring. In others, they hung iron over the doorway to ward off frost spirits. Farmers scattered salt at crossroads, hoping to confuse demons who apparently had poor navigation skills. Even snow had meaning. Fine snow meant a good harvest. Heavy snow meant death would come quietly. And if you made snowballs after sunset, you were said to summon lost souls, which, as far as childhood games go, is impressively dramatic. But not all superstitions were scary. Some were oddly charming. People believed that baking bread during a full moon would make it rise higher, or that wearing garlic on your belt could keep your nose from freezing. If your cow gave milk on Candlemas, it meant spring was near. If your cow didn't, well, you'd better apologize for something. The church, of course, tried to curb these habits. Priests called them pagan leftovers, relics of an older world. But even priests hedged their bets. Many blessed herbs just in case, or muttered extra prayers when traveling alone in a storm. Because really, who wanted to take chances in a world where nature had a personality? Weather prediction was its own branch of superstition. People read meaning into everything. Bird calls, frost shapes, the way a dog howled at night. Old women were especially trusted for forecasts, armed with nothing but experience and the confidence of being slightly intimidating. And then there were omens, a medieval pastime that made every random event meaningful. A candle flickering suddenly, an angel just passed, a log rolling out of the fire, a visitor's coming, a chicken sneezing. That's between you and your conscience. Superstition, in truth, was comfort. It gave people the illusion of control in a world that rarely offered any. You couldn't stop the frost, but you could hang a charm. You couldn't predict famine, but you could throw salt over your shoulder and feel briefly powerful. And sometimes those rituals worked, not because they changed the weather, but because they changed people. They gave courage, unity, and a little spark of magic to hold on to through the dark. So as you imagine those villagers whispering over candles, tossing herbs into fires, and muttering against invisible spirits, don't laugh too hard. Because really, haven't we all done the same? Worn a lucky charm, knocked on wood, wished for something we couldn't control. The medieval world was cold, unpredictable, and full of mystery. And superstition, for all its nonsense, made it feel a little warmer. By February, everything had learned to wait. The village wasn't dead, just sleeping. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, doors stayed shut, and time moved as slowly as frozen honey. Even the dogs barked less, as if noise itself took too much effort. The rhythm of winter life had shrunk to its essentials. Wake up, stoke the fire, eat something vaguely edible, do whatever chores the day required, chopping, mending, fetching, praying, and then retreat back to warmth before your toes developed personal grievances. Outside, the fields lay flat and pale, the trees like ink drawings against a gray sky. The river was a slab of ice. The mill wheel was still. Silence ruled. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of waiting, of endurance, of quiet thoughts that never made it to words. Inside the cottages, people found ways to fill the hours. Mothers spun wool. Children carved toys from scraps of wood. Men repaired tools by firelight, pausing occasionally to complain about the weather. Grandparents told the same stories they'd told last winter and the one before that, and no one minded hearing them again. Food was simpler now. Soups stretched thinner, bread smaller, patience shorter. The festive energy of Yuletide had long faded, leaving behind the long, gray middle of winter where even optimism had frost on it. But there was comfort in routine, in the shared effort of survival, in knowing that everyone, from lord to laborer, was doing the same thing, waiting for warmth. Sometimes villagers gathered in the tavern, where ale and laughter made the room feel briefly alive again. They told stories, traded rumors, and pretended not to notice how cold the mugs were. A fiddler might play, badly, and someone would sing, worse, and for a few moments, life felt generous. At night, the world grew impossibly still. Lanterns went dark, fires burned low, and the snow outside shimmered faintly beneath the moon. From a distance, the village looked like a painting, small, glowing dots of firelight scattered across a sea of white. Somewhere, a rooster crowed too early, confused by the moonlight. Somewhere else, a dog stirred and went back to dreaming of summer. And though no one said it aloud, the villagers knew spring would come. It always did. Maybe late, maybe grudgingly, but it came. So they waited. And in that waiting, in the soft quiet of people simply existing, there was something almost holy. Because winter, for all its cruelty, had also given them this: stillness, connection, and time to remember that they needed one another. By the end of winter, everyone was a philosopher. After months of freezing air, smoky fires, and meals that could double as self-defense, people began to reflect, slowly, deeply, often while staring at nothing in particular. What had they learned? That warmth was precious, that food was sacred, that complaining was a group sport. But mostly they learned endurance. The medieval world was built on it. The quiet ability to keep going when everything around you was still, gray, and difficult. They didn't expect comfort. They expected continuance. And in that, there's a strange kind of wisdom. The cold stripped everything down. No distractions, no luxuries, just people and their resilience. The long nights forced them to talk, to share, to cooperate. The hunger made every loaf meaningful, every fire a celebration. It's easy from our heated rooms to pity them. But maybe they had something we've lost. The ability to appreciate the smallest victories. The spark of a fire catching. The first green sprout poking through the thaw. The sound of the first bird returning from somewhere warmer and smarter. The end of winter wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. One morning the frost melted a little earlier. The sun lingered a little longer. Someone noticed that the mud didn't freeze overnight, and word spread like gossip. It's ending. Cows were led back to the fields. Tools were sharpened. Hope, that fragile, stubborn thing, stretched its limbs and yawned. And though people complained, as they always did, they also smiled more. Because every winter survived was a small miracle, and every spring was proof that even the hardest seasons don't last forever. The lessons of the long cold were simple but eternal. Keep moving. Keep laughing. Share what you have. Light your fire early, feed it often, and when it burns low, huddle close together until it grows again. because that's how they made it. Not through strength or technology or miracles, but through each other. So as you picture the last snow melting into muddy fields, the smoke thinning from the chimneys, and the people stepping out into the weak spring sunlight, think of them, not just surviving, but restarting. The medieval winter didn't defeat them. It taught them patience, humility, and maybe even gratitude, though they'd never admit it out loud. And somewhere, as the first flowers pushed through the thaw, you can almost hear it. A sigh, half relief, half triumph, whispered through time. We made it. Hey guys, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially survived a medieval winter. That's more than a lot of actual medieval people could say. Take a moment to stretch, breathe, and appreciate the modern miracle of central heating. Because tonight, we've trudged through frost, feasts, fleas, and frozen toilets together. And honestly, I think we all deserve a warm drink and a nap that doesn't involve livestock. When we began, the world was locked in ice, silent, gray, and merciless. We met peasants who huddled with cows for warmth, monks who turned prayer into endurance training, and nobles who froze in luxury while insisting everything was perfectly fine. We've watched fires sputter, snow pile, and spirits flicker. And through it all, one thing remained constant: the absurd, magnificent stubbornness of being human. Because that's the secret of the medieval winter. It was never just about the cold. It was about how people faced it, with humor, community, and a little bit of madness. They didn't have insulation or thermostats or Wi-Fi, but they had stories, songs, and each other. And that, in the end, was enough. If you listen carefully, you can still hear it. The soft toll of a church bell somewhere far away. The whisper of wind through thatched roofs. The quiet laughter of people who, against all odds, kept going. So as you drift off to sleep, warm and safe in your own bed, think of them. The tired woodcutter, the coughing monk, the farmer feeding the fire, the mother whispering stories to her children beneath a single wool blanket. They survived winter not because it was easy, but because they didn't have the option not to. And in that stubborn warmth, that small, shared human glow, there's something timeless. If you enjoyed this little historical hibernation, give the video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and maybe light a candle tonight. Not because you need it, but because it's nice to remember what warmth once meant. Thank you for listening, for learning, and maybe for falling asleep somewhere between the fleas and the chamber pots. Until next time, this is Boring History for Sleep, where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Good night, and may your bed always be warmer than a medieval castle.